There is a specific kind of silence that lives in a mountain cabin the week your marriage stops being a marriage. It is not the peaceful silence of a Sunday afternoon. It is not the meditative silence of new snow. It is the silence of two people who used to fill a room, and now only one person is in it. And the other person has left, and the walls have started to hold the shape of both of you, but only make sound for one. That was the silence I was living in on the afternoon of December 23rd, in a cabin my wife and I had built together 9 years ago on a mountain outside Deerfield, Vermont, with 3 feet of snow on the ground and no one else within a mile in any direction. My wife had left 2 weeks earlier. She had said she needed the winter alone. That was the phrase. I need the winter alone. She had flown to Aspen with her friend Margot, who I had never trusted, and she had told me she would call me when she was ready to talk. That was on December 9th. It was December 23rd. Now she had not called. I had planned to spend Christmas Eve by myself in the cabin. I had planned to drink a bottle of bourbon I did not really want to drink. I had planned to feed my dog, an old golden retriever named Bishop who was slowing down and did not care whether it was Christmas or not, and I had planned to go to bed at 9. That was the plan. And then, at 3:30 in the afternoon, somebody knocked on my cabin door. Nobody had knocked on that cabin door in 9 years, except delivery drivers. I opened it. She was standing on my porch in a heavy wool coat, with an armload of split firewood in her arms and snow on her eyelashes. She said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm your neighbor. I brought firewood, and I have been thinking all day, nobody should be alone at Christmas." That was the beginning. My name is Sam Callahan. I'm 39 years old, and I own a small architecture firm out of Boston, Massachusetts. I designed my cabin. I designed most of the cabins in the small mountain community it sits in, an old logging valley outside Deerfield, Vermont, where about 30 families have built weekend and second homes in the last 20 years. My cabin was the first one I ever designed for myself. It is a 2-bedroom timber frame with a stone fireplace and a wall of south-facing windows that catches the morning sun off the ridge across the valley. It has a wraparound porch. It has a workshop out back where I keep the woodworking tools I use when I want to think. My wife Kelsey and I built the cabin together in the summer of 2015. I mean, literally built it. I designed it, and she and I spent 3 months of weekends up here with a general contractor and a small crew, laying the foundation, framing the walls, staining the exterior boards. It was our project. Kelsey is a landscape architect. She did the entire property plan, the stone walkway, the garden, the Mountain Laurel border along the driveway. We got married the summer after we finished the cabin. We got married on the porch of the cabin, in fact. 40 people, Kelsey's mother cried. My best friend Doug played the guitar. My golden retriever Bishop was the ring bearer. He was 4 years old then, in his prime, and he trotted the ring pillow down the aisle like a professional. Bishop is 13 now. He is asleep on the rug by the fireplace as I tell you this. His face is nearly all white. He has arthritis in his hips. He is at the end of his life, and I know it, and I try not to think about it, because thinking about Bishop leaving too is the one thing I cannot afford right now. Kelsey and I have been married 8 years, and for the last 18 months, we have been dying quietly. I want to be honest about how there was no affair, there was no scandal, there was no fight that lit a match. There was just 2 people who had gotten married in their early 30s because it seemed like the natural next step, and who had discovered somewhere around their 7th anniversary that they had accidentally been holding each other back from becoming the people they wanted to be. Kelsey wanted a life that was more social, more urban, more visible. She wanted dinner parties. She wanted to travel constantly. She wanted a version of me that could do those things with her and be lit up by them. The version of me that could do that did not exist. The version of me she had married in 2016 loved a quiet weekend in a cabin with a dog and a book. The version of me she needed by 2023 was somebody else. We tried. We tried for a year. Couples therapy, weekly date nights, a long weekend in Charleston, a shorter weekend in Newport. Nothing worked, because the problem wasn't a fight we could resolve. The problem was that we had grown up. On December 9th, she flew to Aspen with Margot. She said she needed the winter alone. She said she wanted to think. She said she would call me when she was ready. She had not called. 2 weeks of silence in a cabin at the end of a valley road in northern Vermont, with 3 feet of snow on the ground and a 13-year-old golden retriever and a phone that did not ring. I had gotten used to it, mostly. I was not falling apart. I was not drinking too much. I was working, pulling weekend hours on a client's renovation in Cambridge that I could do remotely, and I was walking Bishop twice a day on the plowed sections of the driveway, and I was reading a novel my sister had sent me at Thanksgiving, and I was going to bed at 9 every night and getting up at 5 like a farmer. I was fine. Mostly. But the afternoon of December 23rd, something had shifted. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the fact that the whole valley had started stringing white lights on their porches that week, and my cabin was the only one on the North Road that had none up. Maybe it was the fact that Bishop had refused his breakfast that morning, and I had felt the specific hollow lurch a dog owner learns to recognize in old age. Maybe it was the fact that I had opened the refrigerator at lunchtime and found half a wheel of the good brie Kelsey had bought before she left, and I had realized she was not coming back for the good brie, which meant she probably was not coming back at all. I sat on the couch in front of the unlit fireplace for 2 hours that afternoon. Bishop's head on my knee. I did not turn on any lights. I watched the sky through the wall of windows turn from gray to pink to dark blue. At 3:30, somebody knocked on my door. I did not know who it was. Nobody had knocked on that cabin door in 9 years except delivery drivers, and the driveway had been unplowed for 2 days. I opened it. She was standing on my porch with an armload of split firewood. I want to describe her carefully, because the way she looked on my porch that afternoon was the first thing my brain latched onto when it started to come back to life for the first time in 18 months. She was maybe my age, maybe a year or two younger. She was tall, I am 6'2", and she came up to my shoulder in her boots, which meant she was probably 5'9". She was wearing a heavy dark green wool coat with wooden buttons and a cream-colored knit hat pulled down over dark brown hair that was coming loose around her ears. She had snow on her eyelashes. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. She had gray-green eyes that looked at me directly without any of the polite deflection people usually offer when they knock on a stranger's door. She was holding an armload of split firewood. 6 pieces of it, neatly cut, fresh split. The good kind, hardwood, oak, or maple. She said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm your neighbor. I brought firewood, and I have been thinking all day, nobody should be alone at Christmas." I stood in the doorway with the cold air coming in around me, and I did not know what to say. I said, "I'm sorry. Which cabin?" She said, "The green one. About a quarter mile up, on the east side of the ridge. I bought it a year ago, in November." I said, "I designed that cabin." She smiled. Small, warm, real. She said, "I know. I found your name in the county records when I was buying it. Callahan Design. I was going to introduce myself properly in the spring." I said, "I'm Sam." She said, "I'm Nora, Nora Ellsworth." We stood there for a moment with the cold coming in. Bishop got up from the rug, walked slowly over to the door. He is 13 and moves like it. He sniffed at Nora's boots. He looked up at her. He did the thing old dogs do when they have decided somebody is safe. He lay down at her feet. Nora looked down at him, then up at me. She said, "Oh, what a lovely old man. What's his name?" I said, "Bishop." She said, "How old is he?" 13. She looked at Bishop for a long moment. Then she looked back at me. She said, "May I come in for a minute, just to set the firewood down inside? I don't want to keep the cold in your house." I stepped back. I said, "Please." She came inside. She set the firewood down in the wrought iron holder next to the fireplace. Then she straightened up and looked around the room slowly, the way an architect looks at a space, which she was not, but she was clearly a person who noticed things. She said, "This is a beautiful cabin, Sam." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Your fireplace is not lit." I said, "It's not." She said, "It is 34 degrees outside. You have an open concept living room with a full wall of glass. You are going to be cold in about an hour." I said, "I am aware." She smiled again, small. She said, "Sam, would you let me light your fireplace? Just to get it going, and then I'll leave. I'm not going to impose. I brought the wood because I was cutting mine yesterday, and I had extra. And I know the road up here hasn't been plowed to your driveway, and I thought you might not have gotten a delivery. That's all. I'll light it and then I'll go." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "Nora, would you like a glass of wine?" She stopped. She said, "Sam, are you married?" I said, "Yes." Technically. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sam, I am going to light your fireplace, and I am not going to have wine with you tonight. Because you and I are neighbors and I do not know your story, and technically married is a whole conversation, and I am not going to start something at your kitchen counter on Christmas Eve when I do not know what I am walking into. Okay?" I looked at her. I said, "Nora, that is a very fair answer." She smiled again, a real smile this time. She said, "But if you would like to have coffee tomorrow morning, Christmas morning, at my cabin, at 9 a.m., where the neighborhood knows we are both there, I would like that. And I would like to hear the whole story of technically, and then we can figure out what, if anything, we are supposed to do next." She said the whole thing in one long, steady breath, like she had been rehearsing it in her head while she walked through the snow. I said, "Nora Ellsworth, Christmas morning, 9 a.m., your cabin. I will be there." She said, "The green one, quarter-mile up, east side of the ridge." She knelt by the fireplace, opened the flue, arranged the kindling with the practiced hand of somebody who has been building fires her whole life, struck a match. The kindling caught. The fire started to breathe. She stood up. She said, "Sam, that's an old flue. Have your chimney sweep next spring. There's some creosote up there." I said, "How did you know to look?" She said, "I do chimney safety inspections for our fire department. That's part of what I do." I said, "You're a firefighter?" She said, "Volunteer. I run a small tea shop in town. I have been on the volunteer fire department for 6 years." I laughed. I actually laughed. First time in weeks. I said, "Nora, you are the most Vermont woman I have ever met." She laughed too. She said, "Sam, see you at 9 tomorrow morning. Merry Christmas." She walked out my door, down the porch steps, into the snow. I stood in the doorway with Bishop at my feet, watching her disappear into the tree line up the ridge. Then I closed the door. I turned around. My cabin was warm for the first time in 2 weeks. I sat down on the couch in front of the fire and I stared at it for a long time. I want to tell you what happened next, because I did not sleep well that night. I did not drink the bourbon. I did not do any of the things I had planned to do. I sat in front of the fire until 11. I fed Bishop a small piece of turkey I had in the fridge. I called my sister Meg. She was at her in-laws in Connecticut, and I told her that a neighbor had brought me firewood and invited me for coffee on Christmas morning. Meg was quiet for a long moment. Meg said, "Sam, is she nice?" I said, "She is very nice." Meg said, "Sam, are you married?" I said, "Meg, Kelsey has been in Aspen for 2 weeks. She has not called me. She left without saying when she was coming back. I do not know if I am married. I do not know what I am." Meg said, "Sam, then have coffee with her. But, Sam, you have to figure out where you actually stand with Kelsey before you let this become anything. Okay? For your own sake. For Nora's sake. For everybody's sake. I said, I know. I know. Meg said, but Sam. Yeah, Meg said, it has been a long time since I heard you sound the way you sound right now. I said, how do I sound? She said, awake. I hung up. I stared at the fire. I did what I should have done 9 days earlier. I called Kelsey. She did not answer. It rang 7 times and went to voicemail. I did not leave a message. I sent a text instead. It said, Kelsey, I need to talk to you. Not about a fight, about where we stand. I have been alone in the cabin for 2 weeks, and I am starting to understand what you have been trying to tell me. Please call me tomorrow. Merry Christmas. Sam. I put the phone down. I did not expect her to call back. She called me at 7 in the morning on Christmas Day. I was already up. I had been up since 5. I had walked Bishop on the driveway in the pre-dawn dark. I had built up the fire. I had made coffee. I was reading a book on the couch when the phone rang. I answered. Kelsey said, Sam, hi. I said, Kelsey, Merry Christmas. She said, Merry Christmas. Sam, I got your text last night and I could not sleep. I have wanted to call you for a week and I could not figure out how. I said, okay. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Sam, I want a divorce. I did not say anything for a long time. Then I said, okay. She said, I'm sorry. I know this is not how anybody wants to hear this. And I know Christmas Day is not the right day. But you texted me, and I owe you an answer. And I have been sitting with this answer for 2 weeks in Aspen. And I know it is the answer. I said, Kelsey, I know. I have known for a while too. I think I have been waiting for you to be the one to say it. She said, that is not fair, Sam. That was mine to say? I said, I don't know. Maybe. I think I was too much of a coward to say it, and I think you were too. But one of us had to. I am glad it was you. She was crying quietly on the phone. She said, Sam, I love you. I have loved you for 11 years. That is not the same thing as being your wife anymore. But I want you to know it is not because of anything you did, it is because we grew up different directions. I said, I know, Kelsey, I love you too. I don't want to fight about anything. I want us to be graceful about this. I want us to be adults. She said, I do too. We talked for 45 minutes about the cabin, about the house in Boston, about Bishop, about the practical things people talk about when a marriage ends peacefully. She said she would fly home after New Year's. She said she would stay with Margot until we figured out the housing. She said she would move most of her things out in January. At the end, she said, Sam, are you going to be okay today? Christmas Day, alone. I said, I am not going to be alone today. My neighbor invited me for coffee. She said, which neighbor? I said, the green cabin on the ridge. Nora Ellsworth. She bought it last year. Kelsey was quiet for a moment. Then Kelsey said, Sam, be honest with me. Is there anything? I said, Kelsey. She brought me firewood yesterday. I asked her to have wine. She said no because I was technically married. She invited me for coffee this morning at her cabin because it is neutral ground and because the neighborhood knows we are both there. That is what has happened. Kelsey was quiet for a longer moment. Then Kelsey said, Sam, go have coffee with your neighbor. And when the divorce is done, if she is a good woman, please build a good life with her. I mean that. I am not saying it to be gracious. I am saying it because I loved you for 11 years, and I want you to be happy for the next 50. I said, Kelsey, thank you. She said, Merry Christmas, Sam. I said, Merry Christmas, Kelsey. I hung up. I sat on my couch in front of the fire for a long time. Then, at 8:50 in the morning, I put on my coat and my boots and my hat, and I clipped Bishop's leash to his collar, and we walked out into the snow, and up the ridge road toward the green cabin. Nora's cabin was smaller than mine, but the design was excellent. Clean lines, deep porch, well-placed windows. Someone who understood proportion had built it. She was on the porch when Bishop and I came up the driveway. She was wearing jeans and a cream cable knit sweater. Her hair was up in a loose knot. She saw us, waved. She said, "Sam," and Bishop, "Merry Christmas." I said, "Merry Christmas, Nora." She said, "Coffee's ready. Come in." Her cabin smelled like coffee and cinnamon and pine. She had a small Christmas tree in the corner. Real, not fake, with white lights and old-fashioned glass ornaments. She had a fire going in her own fireplace. She had 2 coffee cups on the small kitchen table. Cream in mine, nothing in hers. She had a plate of small homemade shortbread cookies between them. I said, "Nora, did you know I take cream?" She said, "I guessed. Most men do." I sat down. Bishop lay down at my feet. Then Nora sat down across from me. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Sam, something happened." I said, "How can you tell?" "Because you are not the same man who stood in his cabin doorway yesterday afternoon." I told her about the phone call, about Kelsey, about the divorce. I told her all of it because Nora Ellsworth was a person you could tell things to, and I had not had a person like that in my life for 18 months. She listened without interrupting. She held her coffee cup in both hands. She did not look shocked. She did not look happy. She looked careful. Careful in the way a person looks when somebody is telling them something that matters. When I was done, she said, "Sam, I am sorry." I said, "Are you?" She said, "Yes. I am sorry your marriage ended. I am sorry you have been living in that cabin alone for 2 weeks. I am sorry Bishop is 13 and old and might not be here next Christmas. I am sorry for a lot of things this morning." I said, "Nora, can I ask you something?" "Yes. Yesterday when you knocked on my door with the firewood, was it just neighborliness? Or was it something else?" She held her coffee cup for a long moment. Then she said, "Sam, I want to answer that honestly, and I want to answer it carefully. Is that okay?" "Yes." She said, "I have lived in that green cabin for a year and 1 month. In that time I have watched your cabin from my porch every morning and every evening. I saw you and your wife the first weekend I moved in. You were unloading a truck full of firewood, and she was carrying a small potted plant, and I remember thinking, 'Oh, they're a nice couple. I hope I meet them in the spring.' Okay, but then I watched, and I saw Sam. I saw the 2 of you last summer at the Deerfield Farmers Market. You were about 12 feet behind her. You were looking at the sky. She was looking at her phone. Neither of you was looking at each other, and I thought, oh, that is a couple that is not doing well." I did not say anything. She said, "Sam, I have been divorced for 4 years. My marriage ended for reasons that are complicated and not relevant to this morning. But I have been through what you are about to go through. And I have gotten pretty good at recognizing marriages that are quietly dying. And when I saw your wife's car leave 2 weeks ago and it did not come back, I recognized that too." "Okay." She took a breath. "When I cut firewood yesterday, I had extra." That was true. When I thought about who to bring it to, I thought about you first. Was that neighborliness? Yes. Was it something else? Also yes. But I did not know I was hoping for anything until I got to your porch, and you opened the door, and I saw your face, and I realized. She stopped. She said, "Sam, I realized I had been waiting for you to be single." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire crackled. Bishop sighed and shifted his position at my feet. I said, "Nora." She said, "I know how that sounds." "I know, I am sorry. I should not have said it that plainly. I am 41 years old and I have not dated anyone since my divorce, and I am rusty at this. I am not the kind of woman who—" I reached across the small kitchen table. I put my hand on top of hers. She stopped talking. I said, "Nora, don't apologize." She looked at our hands. She said, "Sam, it is Christmas Day. You just got off the phone with your wife an hour ago. This is not the day for this conversation. This is not the year for this conversation." I said, "I know." She said, "So what do we do?" I looked at her. I looked at the small Christmas tree in the corner. I looked at the fire. I looked at Bishop asleep at my feet. I looked at Nora Ellsworth, 41, cable knit sweater, dark brown hair coming loose from her knot, gray-green eyes. I said, "Nora, I think we have coffee this morning, because it is neutral ground, and because the neighborhood knows we are both here. And then I think you and I do not see each other again for a while. Because I have to go through a divorce, and I have to be alone for a stretch of time, and I have to figure out who I am when I am not somebody's husband. And then when I have done that, when I have earned my way back to being a whole person, I think I come find you. In the spring maybe, or the summer, not before." She looked at me. She said, "Sam, yes, that is the right answer." I said, "How long?" She said, 6 months, maybe longer, until you know yourself. That is the deal." I said, 6 months. 6 months. No coffee, no visits, no firewood deliveries. She said, "Sam, I am not going to stop being your neighbor. If your fireplace flue catches fire, I am coming over. If Bishop escapes into my yard, I am walking him home." I laughed. First real laugh in a long time. I said, "Fair." She said, "But no. No romance, no dating, no kitchen tables. Not for 6 months. Because you deserve to grieve the marriage you had, and I deserve a man who has grieved before he shows up at my door." I said, "Nora Ellsworth, you are the wisest person I have ever met." She said, "Sam Callahan, drink your coffee." I drank my coffee. We stayed at her kitchen table for 2 hours. We did not touch again. We did not talk about romance. We talked about the cabin she had bought, about the tea shop she ran in Deerfield, about the volunteer fire department, about her ex-husband briefly, about my sister Meg, about Bishop, who Nora sat on the floor with for 20 minutes and rubbed his ears until his eyes closed. At 11 a.m., I stood up. I said, "Nora, I have to go. Bishop needs his nap. I need to call my sister. I need to start figuring out what my life looks like." She stood up. She walked me to her door. At her door, she said, "Sam, Merry Christmas." I said, "Merry Christmas, Nora." She said, 6 months. I said, 6 months. I walked back down the ridge road with Bishop. Snow on the trees. Fresh air. The sky was clear. I felt lighter than I had felt in 18 months. I want to tell you about the 6 months. Because 6 months is not nothing. 6 months is January and February and March and April and May and June. 6 months is winter turning into spring, turning into early summer. 6 months is a whole world of days. I honored the agreement. So did Nora. Kelsey flew home the second week of January. We had 2 calm meetings with a mediator. She kept the Boston house. I kept the cabin. We split everything else 50-50. The divorce was final in April. It was, honest to God, the most graceful divorce a couple has ever executed. We ended it as friends. We are still friends. She married a man named Elliot the following November. I sent her flowers. I spent the winter in the cabin. Bishop and I built a rhythm. Morning walks on the driveway. Afternoon work at my desk by the window. Evenings by the fire with a book. I did not think about Nora most days. That was on purpose. I made myself not think about her, because I had promised her, and myself, that I would spend the 6 months becoming a whole person before I let a new person into it. But I noticed her, on the Ridge Road, once a week or so, driving her truck to town. She would raise a hand from behind the steering wheel. I would raise a hand back. Neither of us would smile too much. That was the rule. In February, I drove myself to a therapist in Burlington. I had never been to therapy before. I did not know how to talk to a stranger about my feelings. I fumbled it for the first 3 weeks. Then I got better. By April, I was going every 2 weeks, and I was actually finding it useful. Bishop got weaker. In March, I had to start carrying him up the porch steps. In April, he stopped wanting to walk more than 100 yards. On April 12th, on a warm afternoon, Bishop lay down under the mountain laurel that Kelsey had planted in 2015, and he closed his eyes, and he did not open them again. I sat with him until sunset. Then I dug a grave in the soft spring earth behind the cabin. I called Meg from the porch that night. Meg said, "Oh, Sam." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I will be." I did not call Nora, but 3 days later, at 9 in the morning, there was a knock at my door. I opened it. Nora was standing on the porch with a small clay pot in her hands. Inside the pot was a young mountain laurel, a foot tall, still in its nursery burlap. She said, "Sam, I heard about Bishop. Doug at the general store told me. I am so sorry. I brought you this. Plant it. Plant it wherever feels right." I looked at her. I looked at the small plant. I said, "Nora." She said, I am not breaking the rule. I am not here for coffee. I am here because you lost your dog, and I did not want you to grieve alone this morning. That is what neighbors do." She held the plant out. I took it. I said, "Thank you." She said, "That's all. I'm going home now." She turned to leave. I said, "Nora." She turned back. I said, 2 more months. She smiled, small, warm. She said, 2 more months. She walked back down the porch steps, into the spring air, back up the ridge road. I planted the mountain laurel that afternoon, next to Bishop's grave. May came. My clients in Boston sent me a case of good wine to celebrate a project completing. I did not drink any of it. I saved it. June came. The valley bloomed. The mountain laurel Nora had brought me put out its first small pink flowers. June 16th, which happened to be exactly 6 months and 1 day after Christmas Day, I put on jeans and a clean shirt, and I walked up the ridge road with a case of wine under one arm, and a small potted rose bush I had bought at the nursery in the other. Bishop's old collar was in my back pocket, because I had gotten in the habit of carrying it with me, and I had not been able to leave it at home that morning. I got to the green cabin. She was on the porch, cutting flowers from a rambling honeysuckle vine that grew up the porch railing. She was wearing jeans and a soft blue button-down shirt. Her hair was down, loose, longer than it had been at Christmas. She saw me. She stopped cutting flowers. She said, "Sam?" I said, "Nora, it has been 6 months and 1 day." She said, "It has." I set the wine down on her porch. I set the potted rose bush down next to it. I said, "Nora, I am a whole person now. I did the work. I have earned my way to your door." She looked at me. Her eyes were wet. She said, "Sam Callahan, come inside." I came inside. I want to tell you about the year that followed, because it did not go the way you might expect. We took it slow. Slow was our agreement. Slow was the whole deal from the beginning. For the first month, we had dinner at each other's cabins twice a week. Nothing more. She showed me the tea shop she ran in town, a small place on Main Street called Ellsworth's, with 15 kinds of tea and a cookbook shelf. I helped her fix a leaking roof over the shop back door in July. She had known it needed fixing for a year, and had not gotten around to it. I got a new dog in July, a rescue, a 3-year-old chocolate lab mix named Copper. Copper was Nora's idea. She said, "Sam, Bishop was your good boy. Copper is your next chapter. It is okay to have both." I said, "Nora, are you always right about everything?" She said, "Not everything, just most things." Copper decided within a week that Nora was his real mother and forgot who I was. Every dog in every love story does this eventually. I have made peace with it. By August, Nora was staying over at my cabin most weekends. She kept apologizing for taking up space. I kept telling her she wasn't taking up enough. In September, we drove to Aspen, of all places, because I had a client meeting and she had never been. Nora and I ate at a small restaurant on Aspen's Main Street that Kelsey and I had eaten at once, in 2019. I did not tell Nora that. It was not important. Nora ordered a glass of red wine and looked at me across the table and said, "Sam, I love you." And I said back, "Nora, I love you too." That was the first time either of us said it. We waited for the right restaurant. October, the leaves in the valley turned. We took long hikes. Copper joined us. Nora joked that we had become the annoying kind of couple. I said we absolutely had. She said she was fine with it. November, my sister Meg came out to the cabin for a weekend to meet Nora properly. Meg pulled me into the kitchen after dinner and said, "Sam, do not screw this up." I said, "I do not intend to." Meg said, "Good." December 23rd, exactly 1 year to the day since Nora had knocked on my door with the firewood. I asked her to marry me. I did not do anything dramatic. I did not fly her somewhere. I did not hire a photographer. I asked her on the porch of my cabin, at sunset, while she was drinking a glass of the wine my clients had sent me in April, and Copper was chewing on a stick at our feet. I said, "Nora?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Marry me." She said, "Sam Callahan." "Yes." I said, "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" She said, "I have known for 6 months." We got married the following June, 1 year and 6 months after Christmas Day, 1 year after our first dinner together, 1 year after I had walked up her ridge road with a case of wine and a rose bush. We got married on my cabin porch. Same porch Kelsey and I had gotten married on. Nora had insisted. She said, "Sam, that porch is not haunted. That porch is a good porch. That porch has been waiting for the right wedding." I said, "You are very Vermont, Nora." She said, "I know." At the reception, at the end of the night, my sister Meg stood up and gave a toast. Meg said, "I want to tell you a story about my brother. A year and a half ago on Christmas Day, Sam called me from a cabin in Vermont and told me a neighbor had brought him firewood the day before. He said her name was Nora. He said she was very nice. And I asked him a question I want to ask everyone here tonight." Meg looked around the porch. She said, "I asked him, 'Sam, how do you sound right now?'" She looked at me. She said, and Sam did not know how to answer. So I answered for him. I said, "Sam, you sound awake. You have not sounded awake in 18 months, and you sound awake tonight." Meg raised her glass. She said, "To Nora Ellsworth, to the neighbor who brought firewood on the day my brother woke up, and to the 6 months she made him wait, and to the marriage they have earned." Everybody cried, even the people who had not been introduced yet. Copper stole a napkin from an unattended plate. That was our wedding. There is one more thing I need to tell you. Because 2 years after the wedding, 2 years, 1 month, and 11 days after we got married on my cabin porch, Nora and I were walking around the property one Sunday afternoon in April, checking on the trees Kelsey and I had planted in 2015 that had somehow become the trees Nora and I now tended together. We stopped at the Mountain Laurel, the one Nora had brought me the week Bishop died, the one that had grown up over the last 3 years to nearly 4 feet tall, the one that was, in April, covered in small pink flowers. Nora crouched down at the base of the plant. She touched the soil. She said, "Sam, this is done well." I said, "It has." She said, "You know what I love about this plant?" I said, "What?" She said, "It grew from a place that was supposed to be sad, and now it is one of the most beautiful things on your property." I stood there looking at her for a long moment. Then I said, "Nora, I have to tell you something. I have never told you." She looked up at me. I said, "The day you brought me this plant." In April, 3 days after Bishop died. "Do you remember that morning?" She said, "Of course I remember." I said, "You knocked on my door. You said you were not breaking the rule. You said you were just being a neighbor, and you gave me the plant, and you turned to leave. And I said 2 more months, and you smiled, and you said 2 more months back. I remember. I said, Nora, that was the morning I knew I was going to marry you. She stood up slowly. She said, Sam. I said, I stood on my porch, and I watched you walk back down the ridge road with your empty hands, and I understood that a woman who would show up on my porch 3 days after my dog died with a plant she had bought specifically for me, and who would refuse to break a rule she had made herself, and who would smile at me and say, 2 more months. I understood that woman was going to be the mother of my children someday, and I have known it for 3 years, and I have never told you. Nora was crying quietly. She said, Sam, are we having children? I said, That's actually the other thing I wanted to talk to you about today. She said, Sam Callahan, are you asking me right now on a Sunday afternoon next to a Mountain Laurel? I said, Nora Ellsworth, I am asking you right now on a Sunday afternoon next to a Mountain Laurel. She said, yes. God, yes. Our daughter is 8 months old now. Her name is Robin. She has Nora's gray-green eyes and my dark hair, and a laugh that Copper responds to like it is a command. She sleeps in a crib, in the room that used to be Kelsey's home office, in the cabin I designed for a marriage that ended so that a better one could begin. Every Christmas morning, we take Robin out to the porch, and we look up the ridge road at the green cabin, where Nora still keeps her old address, even though she has been living with me for 3 years. We drink coffee. We watch the snow on the pines. Every Christmas morning, I think about the afternoon of December 23rd, when a woman I had never met knocked on my door with 6 pieces of firewood and told me that nobody should be alone at Christmas. She was right about that. She was right about almost everything. But she was especially right about that. There is somebody in your neighborhood who has been watching your porch light for a while. They know you are struggling. They may or may not have said anything. They are probably too polite. They are probably worried about overstepping. They are probably worried about what your neighbors will think, or what their neighbors will think, or what the rules are for being kind to another adult, without being weird about it. If you know that person, or if you are that person, I want to tell you something. The rules are simpler than you think. Cut some extra firewood. Bring it over. Say, nobody should be alone at Christmas. And then trust the next thing to happen. I promise you, on the other side of that knock is a whole new life waiting to start. If this story reached something in you, if there is a neighbor you have been meaning to check on, or if you have been the one alone on a porch waiting for somebody to notice, hit that subscribe button and tell me about them in the comments below. I read every single one, and every once in a while, one of your stories becomes the next one I tell. Until then, cut some extra firewood. You never know who needs it.